The night fell heavy over the forgotten little town, a place lost to maps and memories. The wind sliced through the air like thin blades, whispering as it weaved between gnarled trees that groaned in agony. It was a night of the waning moon, and the darkness seemed alive, swallowing everything it touched. No one dared walk those streets after sunset. The streetlights flickered, sputtered, as if their glow was being drained by some unseen force. Laura never believed in legends. At 23, she laughed at the old tales passed down by the town's elders, especially the one about the shadow. They said it was ancient, older than the town itself, a presence lurking in places where light had never touched. It had no true form, yet it was heavy, aware, and hungry. According to the legend, when someone crossed paths with it, they never returned the same. Some said they disappeared entirely. Others claimed they remained, empty shells with hollow eyes that stared into nothing. That night, Laura was late, leaving a part-time job at the gas station on the edge of town. She tied her coat tighter around her as the chill dug into her bones. Her car wouldn't start, the engine coughing twice before falling silent, a dead thing under the hood. "Great," she muttered, cursing her luck. The nearest house was a 20-minute walk back into town, and her phone's battery sat at 5%. The road stretched out in front of her, flanked by skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. Each step echoed unnaturally in the silence, as if the earth beneath her feet was hollow. The deeper she went, the darker it got. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was thicker, suffocating, pressing against her skin like invisible hands. A sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A low, dragging noise. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head slowly, and for a heartbeat, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road behind her. But when she squinted into the gloom, she saw it. A shape. It wasn't quite a shadow. It was darker, blacker than black, as though it absorbed the night itself. It slithered across the road, an inky smear against reality, pulling itself forward. It didn't crawl. It flowed, like water with purpose. It moved in unnatural jerks, and with each drag, Laura swore she heard a whisper, a guttural, unintelligible murmur that made her stomach churn. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The shape stopped just a few feet away, coiling and writhing like something alive. Then, it rose. Slowly, impossibly. The shadow stretched upward until it towered above her, a misshapen silhouette that bent and twisted like a broken puppet. And then, it looked at her. There were no eyes, no features, just darkness. But she felt it. It was a gaze that peeled back her thoughts, that clawed into her mind and whispered things she couldn't understand. A weight pressed on her chest, squeezing her ribs as the murmuring grew louder, drilling into her ears. Laura. Her name came from everywhere and nowhere at once, spoken in a voice like dry leaves scraping together. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her hands sinking into the dirt that seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips. The shadow inched closer, its edges flickering and shifting, tendrils of darkness reaching out toward her like hungry fingers. Laura opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Her vision dimmed, her thoughts unraveling like a frayed rope. And then, everything went black. Laura's consciousness was a thin thread dangling over an abyss. For an immeasurable time, seconds, minutes, or hours, there was nothing but darkness. It wasn't sleep or unconsciousness. It was worse. A place where thought dissolved and memories bled like ink into water. Suddenly, she felt the faintest sensation of cold against her skin, then the weight of her own body pressing against rough ground. A muffled sound echoed in her ears, a low, steady thump-thump, like a heartbeat, except it wasn't hers. It was too slow, too deep. Her eyes shot open. The world had changed. She was no longer on the side of the road. Laura found herself lying on her back in what looked like a forest, though the trees were wrong. Their trunks were gnarled and blackened, twisted into grotesque shapes like faces frozen in silent screams. The branches stretched endlessly upward, merging into a canopy so thick that not a sliver of light could penetrate. It was perpetual night here, and the air stank of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. Slowly, Laura pushed herself up onto shaky arms. Her head throbbed, and when she looked at her hands, her breath hitched. Dirt and blood caked her palms. The dark substance smeared up to her elbows. She didn't remember how it got there, and she didn't want to remember. Where am I? Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. It disappeared into the silence, swallowed whole, and then she heard it. The same low, dragging sound as before. It was distant now, but moving steadily closer. Her heart stammered. An instinct screamed at her to move. She stumbled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her, and darted forward. The forest seemed to close in around her, trees looming like silent judges as she weaved between them. The ground was slick, and more than once she nearly slipped. It was only when she paused to catch her breath that she realized what she was stepping on. The earth wasn't covered in leaves or moss. It was flesh. The ground pulsated under her feet, soft and yielding. She gagged, while rising in her throat, but there was no time to dwell on it. The dragging sound was getting closer, and this time, it was accompanied by whispers. Laura. The voice slithered through the trees, oozing into her ears. It spoke her name like it knew her, like it had always known her. A guttural rasp that sounded too close and far away all at once. She stumbled forward, half blind with panic, when something brushed her ankle. She shrieked, whipping around to see what it was. A root, a thick, blackened tendril, was curling around her leg. She kicked it off and bolted forward. But as she ran, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, pleading, laughing, screaming. And then she saw it. Ahead, the forest gave way to a clearing. But it wasn't a relief. It was worse. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit house, its wood rotted and blackened as if scorched by fire. The windows were empty sockets, and the roof sagged like the bones of a dying beast. Yet despite its decay, the house breathed. The walls expanded and contracted with a sickening rhythm, as though the building itself were alive. Laura wanted to turn back, but something drew her forward. The whispers were louder now, overlapping like a chorus of damned souls. Come inside. Her feet moved on their own, the weight of her limbs no longer hers to command. As she climbed the sagging porch steps, the boards groaned underfoot, almost as if they were warning her. The door stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it unnatural, thick as tar. Laura reached out with trembling fingers and pushed it open. The interior of the house was worse than she could have imagined. The walls were lined with faces. Not paintings, actual faces, their skin pale and stretched taut like leather. Their eyes were open, unblinking, and their mouths were frozen in silent screams. Some of them twitched as she passed, their gazes following her. The floor squelched under her steps, sticky and warm. Laura. The voice hissed again, louder this time. It came from somewhere deeper within the house. Her body moved forward, pulled by an unseen force. She passed through rooms filled with horrors. A kitchen where something pulsed on the stove, a bedroom where shadows writhed on the walls like living things. In every corner, in every crevice, she felt the presence watching her. Finally, she reached the door to the basement. The whispers ceased. The house fell deathly silent. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, slick with sweat. Something within her screamed not to open it, to turn and run. But she knew it was too late for that. She had to know. She had to see. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. A smell hit her then. Rot, decay, and something else. A smell so wrong it made her stomach twist. As she stepped onto the first stair, she heard it again. The dragging sound. But this time, it was coming up the stairs. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. From the darkness below, something moved. A shape, blacker than the void itself, began to emerge. It was the shadow, flowing like ink, coiling and unfurling as it dragged itself upward. And then it spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice that reverberated through the entire house. You brought yourself here, Laura. I've been waiting for you. The words slithered into her ears, into her mind. The shadow stretched upward, forming an approximation of a face, featureless but grinning. It surged toward her, and as it did, the faces on the walls began to scream. Laura tried to turn, to run, but the shadow was faster. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her wrists, her ankles, her throat. It was cold, so cold, and it burned like frostbite as it seeped into her skin. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadow's presence. Her vision blurred as the shadow consumed her, her body sinking into it like mud. The last thing she saw was its face, grinning, endless, and then the world went black. And this time, the darkness did not let her go. For a moment, maybe an eternity, there was nothing. No light, no sound, not even thought. The darkness wrapped around her like a second skin, pressing into every pore, seeping into her lungs. It wasn't just outside her, it was inside her now. And then, she woke. Laura's eyes snapped open, and she found herself standing, not lying, not crawling, but standing, in the center of the basement. Her body felt wrong. Her limbs were her own, but heavier, as if something had been poured into them. She flexed her fingers and watched, detached, as they curled and uncurled. Her hands no longer felt like hers. The basement was alive. The walls pulsed, their surfaces rippling with veins of darkness that throbbed like arteries. The floor beneath her bare feet was wet, slick, and warm. The air was thick with that awful metallic smell of blood, so strong it coated her tongue. And there, in the farthest corner of the room, it waited. The shadow loomed, taller than before, a shifting monolith of black tendrils and undefined angles. It was formless yet present, and within its vastness, eyes opened. Hundreds of them. They blinked slowly, glowing faintly like embers, watching her with a hunger that made her insides churn. "You feel it, don't you?" The voice scraped across her mind, louder now, resonant as if coming from within her own skull. "The darkness. I am in you, and you are in me." Laura stumbled back, her breath ragged. She clutched her chest, her fingers pressing into the skin above her heart as if she could claw the coldness out of her body. What are you?" Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The shadow's form shifted, folding into itself and then stretching wider, filling more of the room. Its answer was not words, but a sensation, a memory that wasn't hers. Laura's mind exploded with flashes of impossible visions. A town swallowed by darkness, its streets flowing like rivers of ink. Children screaming as the walls of their homes turned to liquid shadow. Faces frozen in terror as they were dragged into the void. Over and over again, the shadow appeared, consuming, spreading, its hunger endless, its presence eternal. And then, she understood. The shadow was not just a creature. It was a force, older than time, older than thought itself. It was the absence that existed before creation, the hunger that waited in the spaces between light. Wherever it touched, it consumed, erased. And now, it had chosen her. Laura dropped to her knees, gasping for air as the visions faded. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, I won't let you." The shadow laughed, a sound that rattled her bones and turned her stomach. "You already have." She looked down. Her hands were no longer hers. Darkness spread from her fingertips, threading its way up her arms like ink in water. It was alive, slithering under her skin, wrapping itself around her veins. She tried to scream, but her throat locked as the black tendrils slithered up her neck. Laura pushed herself to her feet, swaying as the basement seemed to tilt and warp around her. She had to get out. She had to run, to escape this living nightmare. She turned and stumbled toward the stairs, her feet dragging like lead. The walls groaned, whispering her name as though mocking her. "Laura, Laura." The stairs stretched impossibly high, each step seeming further than the last. As she climbed, the weight in her limbs grew heavier. The darkness inside her throbbed like a second heartbeat, clawing at her insides. By the time she reached the top, her vision was swimming, her strength all but gone. She pushed through the door, collapsing onto the rotting floorboards of the first room. The house was different now. The walls no longer held faces, only smooth, blank surfaces where screams still echoed. Shadows pulled in the corners, and something moved within them, watching her, waiting. Laura dragged herself toward the front door, clawing at the wood like an animal. "Let me out," she cried, her voice hoarse. But the door didn't budge. Outside the window, the forest was gone. Only an endless void remained, as though the world had been swallowed whole. Then, the shadow was behind her. She turned, her body trembling as it filled the room. Its tendrils stretched across the walls and ceiling, slithering like vipers. Its many eyes stared at her, cold, ancient, hungry. Laura backed away, her shoulders hitting the door. "Why fight it?" the shadow cooed, its voice softer now, almost soothing. "You are mine now. You always were." Laura shook her head, tears streaking her dirted face. "No, you can't have me." But the shadow laughed again. It surged forward, tendrils wrapping around her ankles, her wrists, pulling her toward its center. Laura screamed, struggling with every ounce of strength she had left. But it was like fighting against a tidal wave. "Let me show you what you can become." The darkness rushed over her. It poured into her mouth, her eyes, her ears, filling every corner with her being until she felt herself splitting apart. She screamed one last time, but the sound was lost as the shadow consumed her. And then, silence. The house was still. The basement door stood ajar, the stairs leading into unbroken blackness. But Laura was gone. The town didn't notice when she returned days later. The gas station clerk, pale and quiet, took up a shift without a word. Her co-workers commented on how much thinner she looked, how her eyes seemed darker. Hollow. At night, she sat in her car, staring at the empty road where the shadow had first come for her. The darkness stretched endlessly beyond the headlights, whispering to her. And slowly, Laura smiled. She had become something else. And somewhere deep in the forest, where the road bent, and the light dared not touch, the shadow waited. It would call again soon. Weeks passed, and the town began to notice something off about Laura. It wasn't just her appearance anymore, though the changes were undeniable. Her skin had turned ashen, a shade too pale to seem alive, and her eyes were like twin wells of darkness, black irises swallowing any glint of light. She moved differently now, slower, more deliberate, as though every step carried a weight no one else could see. People whispered when she passed. Mothers pulled their children closer. Shopkeepers avoided her gaze. They couldn't explain it, but something about her was wrong. And then, the disappearances began. The first was a young boy, no more than 8, who wandered too close to the edge of the forest one evening. Search parties combed the woods for days, but no trace of him was ever found. Then, a retired teacher vanished on her way home after dark. Her car was discovered by the side of the road, its door ajar, the keys still in the ignition. Whispers spread like wildfire about the old legends, the shadow that haunted the woods, the thing that devoured. Laura heard them all, and each night, she smiled a little wider. One evening, Ethan, the town sheriff, parked his cruiser outside Laura's small rental home. He'd known her since high school and couldn't shake the unease curling in his gut. She had always been strong-willed, loud-mouthed, normal. This person, or thing, walking around in her skin wasn't Laura anymore. He didn't know what it was, but he was going to find out. The house was silent when he knocked. The curtains were drawn, and not a single light flickered inside. Ethan felt the hairs on his neck stand up as he reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. Slowly, he pushed it open. The interior was a ruin. The walls, once plain and white, were blackened with something. Dark streaks that pulsed faintly, as though the wood itself were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with a stench so foul he gagged. The floors were covered in a slick film that squelched underfoot, and scattered across the room were objects that made his blood run cold. Children's shoes, a broken bracelet, an old pair of glasses. The missing people. "Laura," Ethan called, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and fear. He stepped further into the house, his hand hovering near the gun on his hip. "Laura, where are you?" A creak came from the far corner of the room. Ethan turned, his flashlight catching a figure standing in the darkness. Laura, or what remained of her, stared at him with an expressionless face. Her long, dark hair hung in clumps around her shoulders, and her arms dangled limply at her sides. Her shadow stretched unnaturally far across the room, writhing like a living thing. "Laura," Ethan said softly, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "What's happening? What did you do?" She tilted her head, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "I didn't do anything, Ethan," she said, her voice soft and hollow, like the wind through a grave. "It did." Her shadow shivered, then surged forward. Ethan stumbled back, drawing his gun. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice echoing in the rotting house. But Laura's laugh froze him in place. It was low and guttural, layered with something far older than her. "You can't stop it," she said. "It's hungry, and it will spread." Before he could react, the darkness exploded. The shadow rose from the floor like a tidal wave, slamming into him. Ethan screamed as it wrapped around his limbs, pulling him down, in. The blackness poured into his mouth, his ears, his eyes, searing through him like ice. The last thing he saw before the world went dark was Laura's face, calm, serene, as though she were watching a child fall asleep. The next morning, Ethan's cruiser was found abandoned outside Laura's house, the engine still running. Inside the home, there was no sign of him, no sign of her. The house itself looked wrong, though empty. The walls still bore faint streaks of black, and the air felt colder than it should. People who entered swore they heard whispers in the corners, voices calling their names. Days turned into weeks. Then, the forest claimed another victim. A hiker, young and naive, vanished without a trace. And the pattern continued. Each disappearance spread further, beyond the woods, beyond the town, like ripples in a pond. With each soul lost, the darkness grew, and somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the earth, Laura stood beneath an endless night sky, staring into the void. She wasn't alone. The shadow, her shadow, stretched far and wide, flowing like liquid across the land. It whispered to her, promises of eternity, of hunger sated and worlds consumed. The darkness within her had fully taken root, and now it had begun to feed. Laura's eyes, black as the abyss, turned toward the horizon. And slowly, impossibly, she smiled. The shadow was coming. It always did.